Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Increasingly, it's becoming clear that dealing with President Donald Trump is not easy. It's not easy even if you're not an adversary. And friends and allies are struggling to cope not with his policy flip flops, but even in terms of his threats. Like over the last weekend, he threatened the BRIC countries against pursuing any what he called within quotes anti American policies. Now, this is leading to a piquant situation because no country in the world can afford to delink from the United States. It's by far the largest economy in the world. It measures a staggering $29 trillion. China is not even a close second. So then, what do countries do? If this was a case of an equity investment, any portfolio manager would diversify globally while retaining their exposure in the United States. But what if it's a country? Can they afford to do the same? Depend on the United States for technology, security, and trade, but at the same time, hedge their interests with other countries, whether they be Russia or China. Frankly, this strategy or phenomenon, as we can call it, has acquired a moniker called US Plus. And I heard this for the first time from Ambassador Ajay Bisaria in a webinar. Coincidentally, Ambassador Bisaria is with us today to discuss this US Plus strategy and more, and what it means for the world order, including India. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thanks, Anil. Great to join you on your show.
Thank you. See, I wanted to begin with the fact that despite everything, I mean, it's no longer a unipolar world, but the United States continues to call the shots, or at least they decide what the rules are. How come?
Well, I think the big picture is that we are still in a world between orders. So we haven't really exited the US led, UN defined world order that we got so familiar with after 1945. And while there are challenges to that order, and we are perhaps between orders. The U.S. still is, as you said in your intro, the dominant major power. It's a major military power, the major economic power in terms of GDP. And also, I think the additional factor is that the Trump revolution that we've seen over the last few months is unilaterally rewriting some of the rules of that order. So the economic order, the security order, the political and governance order is being challenged by the US itself and continuously being rewritten. So I think that is why the US continues to be very relevant, and most countries continue to be watching the US and dealing with it with a different set of strategies.
So, Ajay, increasingly it's becoming clear that countries are also tiring of this kind of approach adopted by the United States. And you have coined a very wonderful term called US plus strategy. What exactly does this mean, and can you flesh it out for us?
Sure. So, I would make the argument that in a geopolitical hedging sense, what countries tend to do is bypass the US, or, in that sense, it would be a US minus strategy. But in a sense of financial capital and investment and exposure, you cannot exit the US market. So you come to a broader hedging strategy, which would be a bit of US plus. That means you are exposed to the US market, but you don't want to be exposed to a very large extent. You want to change your sort of basket of exposure to diversify your risks a little bit. But even before that, if we talked of a changing order, and we see the world responding in different ways. So, over the last month, if you see a few multilaterals that have taken place at the G7 summit and at the NATO summit, which the advanced economies in the West go through, the attempt is to keep the US in the camp. So the success of those two summits was that we managed to keep Trump pacified and keep him engaged and not have him walk out or just say that these organizations are irrelevant. Similarly, I would argue the Quad. It is important for the other Quad partners that the US stays engaged in the Indo-Pacific in a sort of containment of China situation as well. And it is important that the US hosts the Quad and it remains committed to the Quad. When you look at the BRICS is more of a challenge from the global south to the US led order. And, this is the global south, in a sense, with the extended BRICS asserting that they want a multipolar order. They want an order in which economic power is not bypassing them completely. So I think there are different ways that the world responds multilaterally and even in a bilateral sense. But the other process, you mentioned the US minus kind of strategy. Uh, I would say that friend shoring now is a reality. And what we are seeing is that FDI and FII gets nervous about the volatility in the US market and is looking at other markets because of this volatility. So the argument I was making was that just as India needs to become more attractive, to reform more, to become attractive to the investment, which is was feeling that it was overexposed to the Chinese market, for instance, and therefore a China plus one strategy was developed by Western companies and institutional investors to diversify their risk basket. They would similarly want to diversify away from a very volatile US market, both in terms of direct investment and institutional investment, and look at options. And India, therefore, will not be an automatic beneficiary, but should make itself more attractive to become a beneficiary of this phenomenon.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you need to hedge your bets, but it's not going to be so simple that, like in China Plus, we saw everybody assumed that Vietnam and India would be the biggest beneficiaries. Vietnam did, but India didn't, partly because of what you just said, that we are not undertaken major reforms. But this is the economics part of it, Ajay. What about the strategic part of it? There, I guess countries will have to stay linked with the US and humor President Trump.
I think so. In the short run, at least, there is no bypassing the United States. In a geopolitical and strategic sense, countries will be dealing with Pakistan with the United States. They have developed different strategies. For instance, whether to engage, whether to retaliate, whether to try and to ignore. As China seemed to do in the early part. But I think in different ways, countries will engage with this United States, which is volatile and unpredictable. But the US plus strategy, I think, would be limited to the financial flows. And I would say that the financial flows will get nervous, are already getting nervous about the volatility in the US market and looking at alternative and kind of markets which promise more policy continuity, promise more predictability, more certainty. And a case in point is, for instance, Canadian investments. Now, Canadian pension funds, which have over $2 trillion assets under management, tend to have a lot of exposure ranging from 30-40% to 70% in the US market, simply because it's next door, it's been predictable, and so on. But they would be considering now moving, to in other opportunities in terms of diversifying that risk, and therefore not like to be overexposed to the United States market. So I think that it's early days, but we will be seeing some of these conversations, at least in boardrooms, about how much exposure is reasonable exposure to the US market.
Ajay, that means from what you just said, India has to, meaning get its act right. It's done very well. No denying the fact in the last decade and more. It's no longer the economy that we saw maybe even in 2010. So now, but there is a lot more to be done. So what you're saying is that this kind of volatility is forcing investors to look elsewhere. Typically, you gave an example of the Canadian investment fund, pension fund, sorry, which means India has to start now fast forwarding a lot of pending reforms, right?
Absolutely. I think that is really should be the message to India, because even with China plus one, it has been debatable whether India could get all the potential benefits. India did get a lot of the benefits. For instance, Apple was a classic case, right? It decided to manufacture most of its mobile phones in India, diversifying away from China. But not a lot of investment came to India, because some of it was nervous about Indian regulations and so on. So I would argue that if we reformed much faster, being very sensitive to investor concerns, and overall accelerate the improvement in ease of doing business, we would go get both a China plus one opportunity and a US plus one opportunity in terms of both FDI and institutional investment.
So, what about India's, strategic positioning of itself that we continue to buy Russian oil while it stays under sanctions? So far, we have not come under any sanctions from the United States, but we are seeing signals that the Americans are running out of patience. So, what about this downside of pursuing such a US plus strategy?
Well, I think you have to make hay while the sun shines. You have to keep doing it as long as you can, and then when the balancing becomes very hard, you have to make some tough choices. But I think India has enough heft to practice that strategic autonomy to its benefit, to get those advantages without necessarily having to choose. That was the problem with the Cold War. You had to be either in one camp or the other. But now I think it is up to us, our diplomacy, to negotiate that we need to benefit from both the camps in a conflict situation, and to be able to get the benefits. And if we face sanctions, we face sanctions and we deal with it at that point of time. But till then, I think the attempt should be to benefit from this global fragmentation, from this situation, and that would be the primary driver. The kind of economic benefits that we are managing to get for our economy. And when the balancing act becomes very tough, then we can make a choice at that point.
So, do you believe that the FTA, which India and the US are negotiating, could be inked or could not be inked over the next few days, be a litmus test for the kind of scenario that India is looking at in the next few months or years?
Well, I think it will be an important marker of the India-US relationship, how we navigate and negotiate this. The US is also stuck with taking public positions which go in a certain direction. Trump has to show a win for himself, for the United States. And so I think it's a matter of balancing this. What we achieve before 9th July, before the deadline, do we get something very preliminary and then say that we'll sign something more lasting, or more of an interim trade agreement, the BTAs, when Trump arrives in India, say in September, October for the Quad Summit, and then work in the longer term towards a more comprehensive agreement. So I think that would possibly be the roadmap. But of course, these are volatile times. So there could be, we saw what happened with Canada one fine day. The White House said that we are imposing sanctions, we're stopping all negotiations because Canada did something on data laws, which was not acceptable to the US. So there could be some negotiating tactics at play, but hopefully the scenario would be that we get some kind of interim deal going, which can be projected as a win-win, so that both audiences can be happy, because trade tends to be very sensitive politically. So one side claiming a win and an overwhelming win is not a very good news, because the other side will then see it as a zero-sum game. So I think it is important, but there is a lot more to the US relationship beyond trade. It's also about technology, defense, strategic alignment. So trade is one part of it, but this White House considers it inordinately important, and therefore we have to play along.
So fingers crossed.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll stop at that. It was, as always, a delight to speak to you. You have all heard Ambassador Bisaria. He's been unequivocal about the fact that there are shifting sands in global geopolitics, and some of them relate to this idea of exploring or hedging the US plus in terms of not so much strategic autonomy, but more in terms of economic investments, which opens up a lot more room for a country like India, which is so desperate to find its place on the global high table. But this comes at a cost. India has been dragging its feet on what we call the second generation reforms. The clock is now ticking. India is basically on running out of time, as it were. So it has to act as of yesterday and not tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal.Tech on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions with us. I'm available on X at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.